Open source software. You may have heard of your geeky friend before suggesting Linux or why don't you use the open source one so you don't have to buy an expensive piece of software. That term, open source, if you understand, here's of what it is. We'll start by describing the opposite about open source software. Proprietary or closed source. This stuff follows the centuries-old monetizing. Gather or make something that people want and then sell to them at a given price. Sort of. Through the mandatory licensing agreements that you implicitly sign when you run it. Proprietary software avoids selling you a copy of the software that after you bought it then belongs to you. Instead, they'll sell you a license to use software that comes with a variety of restrictions, including limiting what you may or may not use it, for whether you can share it, whether you're allowed to alter or reverse engineer it, or even limiting the hardware can be installed on. Apple famously gives away their OS X operating system updates for free as long as you get the necessary hardware requirements. So, the opposite of that is selling you a copy of software and really letting you have it? Well, sometimes. The answer is a little bit more complicated than that. It depends on the licensing.
So we'll start with a special case that many folks confuse. With open source called source available, this applies to software that have been published on a blog or otherwise entered a public domain but that the creator has not explicitly allowed modification or use without payment or even at all. Open source software, by contrast, is usually a free software, but this term should be confused because free software is strictly speaking of a more philosophy, and open source is just a development model where many collaborators contribute to a piece of software together to make it deliver as much as value to the user as it can. So let's talk advantages. First, it's free to use, and it's like most open source programs, it's licensed under the GPL, General Public License. It can actually be studied, modified, and shared as often as you want and with whomever you want as long as the derivative works carry the same freedom. On top of that, the open source advocates will point to quick implementation of new features and standards and security and error checking benefits of having a huge community overlooking the development. But there are two sides to every coin, and direct traders often points out that without the guiding hand in a senior PV is something or other, it's easy to end up with underlying code that as wonderful as a bacon flavored mouthguard, and user interface on top of that flat out impossible for the average user to navigate. Not to mention that there's no tech support hotline, reducing its usability once more. So then, why do developers contribute their valuable time to this? Well, some come from strong moral beliefs that everyone should have access to functional and secure software, others do it just for fun, or to share the little projects they created in their spare time and see what happens to them as others continue to modify them. And others have actually found ways to make money by giving the software away, whether it's charging or support, charging for optimized hardware, or charging other companies sponsorship fees for access to their larger installed base.